Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Sungazer, Perihelion. Sungazer is the electro-jazz duo of bassist Adam Neely and drummer Shawn, and if you're surprised that this video exists, you shouldn't be. I can't imagine most of my audience will need an introduction to Adam Neely, given he's one of the most easily recognizable music theory YouTubers, with an audience of nearly 1.5 million. I'd be very surprised if there wasn't at least a pretty decent overlap between those who watch my videos and those who watch his. But yeah, I myself have been watching his stuff for several years and consider him to be an inspiration on my own work as well. And that includes both his videos and his work in this band. They'd released 2 kinda self-titled EPs before this that largely fall under the same style of electronic-infused jazz music, both of which I thought were quite solid. The second one was definitely better. Now, it may be true that Sungazer is kind of more of a jazz project above all else. All their stuff is marked as jazz on iTunes, and all their material seems most specifically designed to be played by a live band with real instruments. But they're also marked as electronic on Bandcamp, and all their material has very much been synth-heavy and, had a strong electronic sheen to everything. Maybe even bordering on IDM. And I mean, I've already covered the jazz band The Comet Is Coming once years ago while qualifying them within my genre boundaries, and Sungazer is much more overtly electronic than those guys are, so yeah. Anyway, hearing that these guys were going to be putting out an entire full-length album had me pretty excited. And after hearing it, I mean, Perihelion is pretty much everything you'd expect it to be if you'd heard any of their previous work. It's a lushly produced blend of off-the-wall irregular rhythms and grooves and spicy but satisfying jazz harmonies. Also lots of focus on creating liminal spaces, as it were, in its mixes of synth textures, electronic effects, and the live band instrumentation. And all of it is a ton of fun to listen to. Really refreshing and uplifting stuff that'll both scratch the itches of music theory nerds looking to hear some really complex rhythmic structures, but by no means requires that kind of knowledge or background to be able to get into. Never letting the complexity become more of a priority than just getting the music to sound and feel good. First listen to this thing, I was ready to immediately plop this thing in my year-end list. With that said, I'd be lying if I said I didn't have my issues with it. And there is one really bizarre issue that I've had with this project regarding its mastering. I don't think this has been as bothersome an issue for most people that I've seen, but it really stuck out to me and I had to mention it because it is just this big thing that I could not ignore. So my first listen of this album was on my laptop here. And my laptop has an automatic bass booster on its audio driver that I can't turn off. Most of the time there's not a huge difference between when I listen to music on that thing and when I just listen to it on my iPod or phone. But for whatever reason, this album didn't sound nearly as good on either of those latter devices. There was a noticeable downgrade in sound depending on where I listened to it. On my iPod and phone, there was a lot less bass presence, and the drums felt like they were mixed higher than they needed to be, giving the whole project an oddly hollow and stiff treble-heavy feel that seemed to directly go against the vibe that the album was going for. But on my laptop, it sounded perfectly spot-on, full-sounding and well-balanced, with no musician or musical element feeling any more important than another. And I was using the same headphones the whole time, too. That wasn't part of the equation. It just needed my laptop's bass booster to sound right. The only other time I've heard this drastic a difference between the sound of which device I was listening to was when I was making my own last album, Noontide Side Attic Drifter. I remember working on some of the random demo sessions in the months leading up to that album, transferring them to my iPod when I was done with each session, and then just being shocked at how much worse the groove sounded on there. So when I put the final album together and mastered it, I did it on an entirely different laptop without a bass booster so that it would sound good across all devices. And it really threw me off to run into this same issue on an album which had professional mixing and mastering engineers working on it. Again, I haven't really seen this bother most people, and everyone I've seen has gotten into this stuff just fine. It's not going to change my recommendation that you should give it a shot. But given the vast majority of my music listening is on my iPod, this can be a bit of a deal breaker for me, and likely will lead to me not coming back to this album as much after posting this video. Now, even with this issue, I'd still say this is a very good album. Even with the subpar mastering on my iPod, I still really like the whole thing. It's just that one issue was just enough to prevent this album from crossing over into great territory for me, when otherwise it would have easily been year-endless material. It would have been amazing. Like, compositionally, this thing is excellent. It's consistently exciting and easily replayable, and lived up to all my highest expectations for it. So, I guess I'm glad it at least feels fully formed and well-balanced on one of my devices, instead of none of them. Now, in terms of individual tracks, there's quite a bit to cover here. Most of my favorite material from this project falls within the first half. Opener Threshold is an absolute stunner to kick us off that sounds great regardless of my listening setup. Tons of expansive space being filled by all the skittering synth rhythms and then absolutely exploding in the most satisfying way. Also doubling as an experiment to combine the slowest and fastest rhythms humans can easily perceive and feel as a coherent groove. I think this was pretty consistently my personal favorite cut in the bunch, especially with the way all those flute tones are used. Excuse me, I mean shakuhachi. Asian woodwinds. Machina features a fittingly much more mechanical groove that seems to operate in regular 4/4 at first, but every couple of beats the main pulse seems to subtly shift in places in such a way you don't notice until it's been going for a second or two and then your next foot tap isn't in the right place. All These People was probably my least favorite on the album when I first heard this thing, given its being built around a pitch-down vocal sample that kind of threw me off in the way it was processed. But this quickly grew to become one of my biggest favorites with more and more listens. The chord progressions and guitar solos just get too epic and driving to be denied, and the sample kept getting catchier to me. Also doesn't hurt that most of these other tracks either have a pitch-down sample like that, or vocals which are heavily processed to have a similar texture to the samples. The latter technique as seen on following track, The Dark, featuring Hannah Sumner. Well, her presence on this track is probably the least processed performance on the album, but there's still, like, I guess some foreman shifting or something like that going on here. And unlike when Madian was doing this stuff on Good Faith, all the core emotion underneath the original performance is still kept intact. And they even brought in a whole string orchestra to accompany the mix for the heck of it. It sounds fantastic. This was another major highlight for me. And yet another major highlight was the next track, Lunar, which starts out as a stripped back solo bass piece, switches into like a minimal IDM piece with the same lead melody, then rapidly switches into this huge sounding, hard-hitting, like Dynatron style synthwave piece, albeit with a typically slightly irregular groove. It manages to both be a breather for the album's pacing while also being one of its heaviest bangers. Now, the album gets a bit spottier for me in its second half, and it's at this point where my weird mastering issues really start to cut into my enjoyment of this thing a lot more. Days into Nights is a fairly normal-sounding ballad with the heavily processed vocals of Jay Soto, and this is probably the one track that most got killed by the weird mastering issues. Since Adam's bass performance is all the low end you really get, and when that bass doesn't feel like it has enough presence, this cut just kind of became an awkwardly lumbering and unsatisfying drag, when it otherwise would have been a nice little emotional moment. Also wasn't huge on the pitch down sample on that one either, but whatever. The title track also absolutely needed that greater bass response to work the best. The first half of this track just kind of sounds like any other Sungazer track, didn't really stick out to me. But it's got most of its cards stacked in the second half when those much more intense rhythms come in, and we switch into what Adam and Shawn have referred to as, I believe, 13-tuplet reggaeton. On my iPod, this moment didn't stick out to me at all, but on my laptop, this whole section was one of the most epic and propulsive parts of the whole album, and freaking amazing. And sure, that's only half of a big highlight, but still a pretty awesome moment, provided I have the right setup. Similarly, A Song With No Words mostly left me a bit cold, even though I absolutely believe a much more ambient-centric cut like this was necessary to keep the album varied and well-paced. On my iPod, it was an empty-sounding filler cut that didn't really leave much of an impression, and on my laptop, well, it was still kind of a filler cut, but it at least did its job as a more atmospheric moment for this album. I didn't quite like it for what it was, had a lot of good saxophone melodies. And the album does pick back up after this somewhat more underwhelming run of tracks. We of course get Thicc, which on first listen mostly just elicited mildly amused eye rolls and kind of made me feel sorry for Hannah Sumner. having left that phone message about her being sick and needing to reschedule, only for Adam to hear and think, oh, she said the meme word. Let's make that into a song. As Adam Neely for you, always eager to satisfy the 10-year-old in all of us. With that said, despite the shitposty nature of the track, it does absolutely have one of the best grooves in the bunch, and fittingly the thickest of bass lines. And the repetitive phone message samples do oddly create a pretty solid hook. I guess you could say their repetition legitimized it. There's also that whole section near the end where the whole thing abruptly devolves into a blaring, chaotic noise piece with a detuned microtonal keyboard solo thrown on top. Pretty kick-ass. This track went from feeling like a total joke to becoming one of my big favorites from this album. While also still feeling like a total joke. And for the ending, we go from the album's most shitposty moment to its most sincere and heartfelt, Cytherean, which actually features Adam's own vocals. Both doing little processed bits of spoken word and properly singing. Well, he does sound pretty self-conscious about his singing, given how he's almost mumbling his parts. And it is maybe a bit off-putting to hear him talking about being in love right after the track that just went thick, thick, thick. Slight tonal whiplash there. But hey, his performance isn't too bad. He's hitting the notes, he sounds nice, you can still detect the emotion beneath all the vocal processing. And this track does have some legit pretty and expansive sounding moments that do help it work as a bookend to the opener in that way. Maybe not quite one of my biggest favorites, but still quite solid. But yeah, that's everything on Perihelion. Yeah, I mean, I still like it a lot in spite of my issues. It basically just comes down to that one problem, the weirdly undercooked mastering. Maybe it was meant to sound like that, but it does strike me as very weird that an album co-written by Adam Neely, a guy who's built his entire brand around bass, is lacking in the low end. I mean, who knows, maybe it was meant to better highlight Shawn Crowder's drumming. And, you know, I will not deny he is an incredible drummer that can make all these odd off-kilter grooves sound completely natural, and you can tell how integral he is to the equation from how it does feel like a lot of these tracks were written from the drum tracks and the rhythms as the starting point from which everything was built. It's just the fact that this album sounds so much better balanced just on my laptop with the bass booster. That has me wondering whether the mastering engineer was also working on a computer like mine that also had a bass booster, and that effect, this weird effect, may have been an unintentional blunder. Obviously don't know. But regardless, as much as I have ragged on this specific point, the album was not totally ruined by it. It's still very good. It had lots of tracks that could really hit and pull me in. It's a really tight listen as well, only 40 minutes. The missed potential for this to have become amazing and one of my easy favorites of the whole year does really frustrate me, but I still liked it enough to give my recommendation. And it also made me really want to hear this stuff in a proper live context too, where it was probably most designed for. I missed their last tour this past month when they came here to Chicago, but I may have to come for whenever they show up here next time, I guess. Whatever, take that all as you will. I guess I can give this a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.